Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died. He had complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease after a long history of heart problems, including a heart transplant. A family statement says he was with family members as he passed Monday night, including his beloved wife of 61 years, Lynn, and his two daughters, Mary and former Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney. He was 84.
American politics has always been a tough business. Even in 1787, here in Philadelphia, when George Washington himself wondered if delegates could ever agree on a constitution. They did agree, as Americans always have when it mattered most.
That was Cheney at the Republican National Convention in 2000, accepting the vice presidential nomination for the first time. But he served more than one president in a political career spanning decades, beginning as a congressional intern, a number of positions in the Nixon administration, then rising to White House Chief of Staff in the Ford administration. In his sixth term as a congressman, when he became defense secretary for President George H.W. Bush, and later vice president to George W. Bush, with time as an oil executive in between. By the 2004 Republican National Convention, as Cheney was accepting his second VP nomination, the U.S. was fighting in both Afghanistan and, controversially, Iraq in the aftermath of 9/11.
Just as surely as the Nazis during World War II and the Soviets during the Cold War, the enemy we face today is bent on our destruction. As in other times, we are in a war we did not start and have no choice but to win.
The family statement calls him great and good, a noble giant of a man who taught his children and grandchildren to love our country and to live lives of courage, honor, love, kindness, and fly fishing. But vice president was not a role Cheney was supposed to play for the younger Bush. Fox News contributor Karl Rove was deputy White House chief of staff in former President George W. Bush's second term, but was working with the first Bush campaign when the then Texas governor started leaning toward Cheney. I wanted to start off by asking, from your time in that White House, how do you remember him?
Well, maybe we ought to start before then, because he was in charge of the vice presidential selection process. He and a bright young lawyer daughter, Liz Cheney. And he was then CEO of Halliburton in Dallas. And very exhaustive, very meticulous. There were 9 people we were looking at. But interestingly, the more the process went on and the more interaction that the governor of Texas had with the CEO of Halliburton, the more impressed he was with the Cheney's mind, the way he thought, his frankness, his candor, his insights. And the more that the process went on, Bush was like, none of the rest of these 9 match up to what I'm getting from this guy. Because Bush, look, his father had been vice president. His father had been president. He had seen 12 years of a White House in which his father was intimately involved. And so he knew that it was important to have a vice president who had good judgment, who would do the work, who would speak candidly, who would understand that a president needs to have people around him who tell it with the bark off. And he became convinced Cheney was that kind of guy. And I was looking at it from a political perspective in the campaign. I was the chief strategist. And so as we talked, he'd bring up Cheney and I'd be dismissive. And then he got serious about it, and he knew that I had concerns. So he was out on the campaign trail. I can't remember where. I think it's like Iowa. And he calls me and he says, I had a red phone. Karen Hughes, Joe Alba, the campaign manager, Karen Hughes, the director of communications, and I had red phones on our desk. Only one person had that number. And so if the red phone rang, it was him. The red phone rang. He said, look, I know you're not for Cheney, but I want you to come and make the case to me tomorrow. I'm coming back tonight, as you know. I'll be arriving late. Come over at 10 o'clock on that morning, and I want you to make a case, come to the governor's mansion, and tell me why I shouldn't go with Cheney. Come prepared to make the case against him. So at 10 o'clock, I show up, and we're sitting in a room not much larger than this room, the Austin Library. The Texas governor's mansion is relatively small. It was built in 1854 when there were Comanche Indians 20 miles to the west. I mean, it's big grown, but the original house itself is relatively small. So we're sitting there, and he says, "Okay, why shouldn't I go with Cheney?" And I still have the piece of paper with my 8 reasons. Number 1, Wyoming. Don't need to worry about it. Cheney's home state. The 3 electoral votes are in our column. Number two, Cheney was a very conservative congressman from a very conservative state, and he cast a lot of stupid votes, including being one of three members of the House to vote against a resolution calling on the apartheid regime of South Africa to move Nelson Mandela from the island prison where there was no doctor to the mainland prison where there was a doctor. It wasn't let him out. It was make certain he has access to health care. Guy had his first heart attack at 37, been working on perfecting it ever since. People say he won't last 4 years. We worked to develop the image of you as your own guy, not mini-me to your dad. So what the heck? Let's bring in the guy who was your dad's Secretary of Defense in a time of war. Everybody's going to be saying Cheney's running the West Wing. You're a Texas oilman. That's a problem in the Northeast and the Midwest. What the heck? Let's double down on it. Let's get the guy who runs the largest oil field service company in the world, Halliburton. And anyway, Bush is not a monologue.
That's a long list of concerns.
Well, I had 8 of them. The 12th Amendment. We won't bore everybody with that. But, and President Bush is not a monologue guy. So this is like World Wrestling Federation. I'd make a point. He'd say, nobody's ever going to bring up that stupid vote, but that's not a bad blah, blah, blah. And anyway, we're going at it. In fact, at the end, it took like 30, 35 minutes. I realized I couldn't open my coat because I had sweat through my shirt. And in this, back and forth with the governor of Texas. And at the end of 30, 35 minutes, he said, got anything else? I said, no, that's it. He said, good, really good. Turned to the guy sitting next to him and said, Dick, got any questions for Karl? Cheney had been sitting there while I pounded him for 30 or 35 minutes.
Wow.
Listening. And as we walked out, Cheney says, I agree with some what you have to say. It was Bush wanted him to know a couple of things. One, that Bush appreciated people who would give their candid opinion, that you had to be willing to do it in front of somebody that might disagree with you, even on a deeply personal level like Cheney probably did, but that was how he's going to run his White House. And he wanted to lay all the issues out on the table so that Cheney also had a sense that Bush had taken these into consideration and was still determined that he was the right choice. So it was sort of an inauspicious way to begin a relationship, but I came to feel very close to Vice President Cheney, and we worked together for the next 7 years, 8 years, and became friends. And we went hunting together and fishing together, and were colleagues in the White House. And he could not have been a nicer, kinder, more thoughtful, more humble, candid advisor than you can imagine. And I saw him time and again do exactly what the president wanted, which was share his opinion. And then once a decision was made, marshal the White House apparatus to execute it, whether it was the opinion that he would have made, the decision he would have made, or another one.
I think even as president, though, Bush would make some jokes about Cheney's authority in his administration.
Right.
Did that seem to bother Cheney at all, the things that people would say about how much power he had? Was he worried about that, even from the standpoint of being worried, for the president taking that kind of heat? Well,
he sort of knew that you couldn't avoid it. There wasn't anything you could do about it. And, he made light of it. There was one Washington address where I think it may have been even after he left office, where it was talking about Star Wars, the missile defense system, and he said he thought this particular conference was going to deal with some issues involving missile defense and Star Wars, as it was called in the Reagan years. And he said so he thought it was quite appropriate that Darth Vader, be invited, Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, be invited. But no, the popular press on it and the movies and so forth all depicted, President Bush is a Yale history major and a Harvard MBA, and people would like to diminish him by, depicting him as the village idiot from Midland, but he has a very interesting mind, retains everything. That was one of the interesting things about working in the White House. The president would say, "I read your memo. Didn't you have a different opinion 6 months ago when we last visited this issue?" And it was not, "I got you." It was, "Why'd you change your mind? Mm-hmm. What new fact, what new side of this issue did you look at?" And the vice president knew that. And the idea that Dick Cheney went into the White House, as some of the popular fiction is, and sort of ran things behind the scenes, is just as idiotic as the idea that Ronald Reagan was a moron and that everybody around him manipulated the well-meaning Ronald Reagan. He was a very sharp man, as was Dick Cheney and as was George W. Bush.
9/11 obviously changed everything.
Right.
And really so soon after their first administration began. How did Cheney and the administration handle that pressure, the responsibility to stop another attack
Right.
and to seek justice?
Well, it became job number one. And the president articulated that we need to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them again on our own soil. And Cheney paid particular attention to this, dug in deep. He had a good relationship with Donald Rumsfeld, who had been his boss in the Nixon White House some, 20, nearly 30 years before, over 30 years before. And so that was helpful. And Cheney also, had been Secretary of Defense, so he had a broad sense of the ability of the United States to do things. And he also had a good relationship with the director of the CIA. So, and Condi Rice, who was National Security Advisor, and Colin Powell was Secretary of State, all of that. I mean, each one of them might have a different attitude about certain things, but together they made a powerful combination. And Cheney played a very important role in both formulating what the administration would do and, more importantly, making certain that it was executed.
No shortage of controversy, though, especially when it came to the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hope that is not what he is remembered for?
Well, I hope he's remembered for what he was, which was somebody who gave enormously to this country, who came into the White House and is about the age of 30 as an aide to Rumsfeld in the Nixon administration. When Nixon leaves office and Gerald Ford becomes president, he becomes the youngest White House chief of staff in history, age 34. Suffers his first heart attack, incidentally, 3 years later at the age of 37. Then when Ford is defeated for election in 76, he goes back to Wyoming, and in 78 is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Wyoming, serves 10 years, and is made a member of the Republican leadership in his freshman term. He was that respected and that well trusted by his colleagues. And he revered the House of Representatives. He and Liz Cheney wrote a book about the House and its speakers. Mm-hmm. He was a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, and she was a noted scholar, and they wrote a wonderful book about the House. And he thoroughly enjoyed it, but it says something about him that, he walks in from, Wyoming with one congressman, and his colleagues respond by saying, we want you as a freshman to be part of the leadership. And by the time he left, he was the Republican, I think he was number 2 in the Republican leadership. Became Secretary of Defense, which is the reason he left. John Tower is nominated by Bush 41. The Senate rejects him, and they almost unanimously confirm Dick Cheney as the replacement, and he presides over the first Gulf War. And then he becomes vice president. So, look, the Iraq War is going to be part and parcel of history's judgment on the Bush administration, but it's not the complete measure of Dick Cheney nor of George W. Bush.
He and his daughter, now former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, were also highly critical of President Trump. Did that surprise you, the way that he was so public about it, and the fact that he even said, look, I'm voting for a Democrat in last year's election?
I'm not certain that he did vote for, save that about, Liz did, but I'm not certain he did. But look, Dick Cheney was straightforward. I mean, I grew up in the West. He was born, I think, in Lincoln, Nebraska, and grew up in Casper, Wyoming. Westerners tend to be straightforward. And when Cheney felt strongly about something, you'd hear from him. Now, it was always polite, pleasant, direct, not bitter, angry, divisive, but if he felt strongly about something, he'd speak out. Now, as he was vice president, he felt a intense responsibility to serve the president in whose administration he was serving. But as a private citizen, if he called balls and strikes as he saw them.
The Associated Press calls Cheney one of the most powerful and polarizing vice presidents in U.S. history. Former President Bush calls him a patriot, a calm and steady presence in the White House amid great national challenges, and he says history will remember him as among the finest public servants of his generation. I'm wondering, what is something that people maybe don't know about Dick Cheney that you would want them to know and to remember?
Well, I do want them to remember his public service. I mean, this is a man who gave all but 4 years as an adult, gave all but, well, maybe 5 or 6 years of his adult life was committed to being the CEO of a big company. The rest of it was devoted to public service. And that says something, because he was incredibly smart, incredibly able, turned Halliburton into a juggernaut in the oil service sector, made it the biggest such company in the world. And yet that was just a small part of his life. The rest of his life was working in the White House Chief of Staff, member of Congress, Secretary of Defense, and Vice President of the United States. And that's really a remarkable thing for somebody who devoted so much of his life to that. And he was a modest guy. Visited his home in Wilson, Wyoming, and in McLean, Virginia, and we went hunting together and fishing, and one of my favorite pictures is Dick Cheney and I each on a horse in Georgia. In Georgia, they hunt quail. You ride a horse through the forest, and then you dismount and go after the birds. And there's Dick Cheney and I playing cowboys. I mean, it's a very funny photograph. But he was a very kind man. Loved his wife. He marries his high school sweetheart. Mm-hmm. He loved his girls. He loved his grandchildren. I remember one summer, and this is after he left the White House, obviously, I can't even remember where we were, maybe we were hunting, and I said, "How was your summer?" And he had apparently, he got in his pickup, hooked up the horse trailer, and drove one of his granddaughters, who was a barrel racer, to all the county rodeos in Wyoming. Can you imagine? There's a former vice president of the United States, and he's cleaning out the horse trailer from the horse creating a mess in there, and taking his granddaughter to rodeos, county rodeos.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for sharing so many of your memories.
Yeah, a good and great man.
Karl Rove, Fox News contributor, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Lisa.